المستقبل هاجس البشرية الأزلي عبر العصور. هناك أصرت على تخيله وصناعة تفاصيله، وهناك انشغلت بماضيها وحاضرها فقط. ما نراه اليوم من تطور كان خيال أحدهم في الماضي، لذا دعونا نتخيل المستقبل معا.
التكنولوجيا المتقدمة تخلق فرص جديدة، والتكنولوجيا اللي يجري تطويرها اليوم ترسم ملامح المستقبل وتدعم النمو الاقتصادي والاجتماعي. البيانات والمعلومات هي نفط المستقبل. Data is the new oil، وهي الأساس في توفير حلول رقمية لدعم التقدم في مختلف المجالات، وأهمها قطاع الصناعة.
Technology's mission is to solve problems rather than mimicking a particular fancy state. When aircraft is invented, the goal is not to try to be like a bird. It is really to transport people from a place to another place. If we view AI in that lens, you will see that AI actually is going to be able to create values and also going to be impact on almost all the problems. That's why I think AI is very important to be at the center stage for our future technological environment.
استشراف المستقبل لا يقوم على التخمين ولا يقتصر على التنبؤ، لكنه يتطلب البحث والتطوير بأدوات علمية.
So I would say when the decision makers are informed about this potential of AI and also this capability and also the limitation of AI, maybe also the risk of AI, they will be able to ask the right questions.
وليس خفياً على الجميع أن التكنولوجيا عصب رئيسي في مستقبل كافة القطاعات، وتعتبر الروبوتات والذكاء الاصطناعي من أبرز هذه التقنيات الرئيسية. كما أن مستقبل الرعاية الصحية يعد بالكثير، خاصة مع تطور تطبيقات الهندسة الجينية وعلوم الجينوم وأبحاث الأمراض النادرة والأوبئة عالمياً، وتسريع تطبيق علوم النانو في تطوير أساليب العلاج التقليدية.
كل مجالات الصناعة في العالم بيزداد ارتباطها بالتكنولوجيا المتقدمة، لأنها توفر النفقات وتكاليف التشغيل وتعزز المرونة وتزيد التنافسية وتحسن جودة ونوعية المنتجات وتسرع وتساعد في عملية اتخاذ القرار.
ومن المهم أن يدرك الجميع أن عدد الفرص المرتقبة في مجال التكنولوجيا والابتكار لا حصر لها، مثل توظيف التطور التكنولوجي والمواد الحيوية في تخفيض حجم النفايات البلاستيكية وتخضير المناطق الصحراوية لزيادة المساحات الصالحة للحياة، وحماية المحيطات ونظمها البيئية وثروتها السمكية، وضمان سلامة وخصوصية البيانات الشخصية، وتطوير نظام تعليمي مشترك، والانتقال إلى مفهوم التصنيع الشامل والسريع.
دولة الإمارات تستثمر في النفط والغاز الأقل في التكلفة والانبعاثات الكربونية على مستوى العالم، وتستثمر كذلك في مصادر الطاقة المتجددة والطاقة النووية، وفي أنواع جديدة من الطاقة الخالية من الكربون مثل الهيدروجين. التكنولوجيا المتقدمة تلعب دور حيوي في خفض الانبعاثات والحد من تداعيات تغير المناخ.
Talking about the UAE, for example, we have a lot of needs to elevate, to evolve, from fossil energy to future clean energy, renewable energy. We need to solve the problem of, food and water safety. We need to also, build better logistics to run our ports, run our facilities, right? We need to also develop technologies to improve our environments and so forth. So all this actually will point to, a new capability of making smart decisions.
أحب أقول لأجيال المستقبل أن من الممكن لآلة واحدة القيام بعمل 100 شخص، ولكن لا يوجد أي آلة بإمكانها أداء عمل شخص مبدع واحد. الإنسان هو دائما الأساس. عقل وقدرة وإمكانية وكفاءة الإنسان هي اللي تصمم وتطور التكنولوجيا.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صاحب السمو شيخ محمد بن زايد آل نهيان ولي عهد أبو ظبي، نائب القائد الأعلى للقوات المسلحة، سمو الشيوخ، أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، الضيوف الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اسمحوا لي بداية بالتعريف عن نفسي. معكم طيف محمد الأميري، مدير إدارة الاتصال الحكومي بوزارة الصناعة والتكنولوجيا المتقدمة، ويشرفني اليوم أن أتولى مهمة إدارة هذا الحوار في هذا المجلس الكريم. محاضرة اليوم تستعرض أشكالاً مختلفة من التقنيات ذات الصلة بعالمنا الحديث، وكيف ستؤثر علينا على المدى الطويل، كما تقدم تصوراً مستقبلياً لما سيكون عليه العالم بعد تكيفه مع هذه التقنيات التي ستحدث تغييراً جذرياً في المستقبل، حيث سيقوم إدوارد جونغ بتقديم محاضرة بعنوان مواجهة أهم التحديات العالمية من خلال الابتكار، وسيقوم من خلالها باستعراض رؤيته وأفكاره في هذا المجال. ونلفت إلى عنايتكم إلى أن المحاضرة ستكون باللغة الإنجليزية، وبإمكانكم استخدام السماعات لمتابعة الترجمة الفورية. واسمحوا لي الآن بأن أتحدث باللغة الإنجليزية. Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the third lecture at مجلس محمد بن زايد, entitled How to Solve the Biggest Global Challenges Through Innovation. It is a subject of critical importance to the United Arab Emirates. In recent years, our government has fully embraced new ideas to address many of the pressing issues we face, from the development of new technologies and new sources of energy to revolutions in farming and food production. But just as important as a culture of innovation is an appetite for collaboration. The issues of climate change, food insecurity, and global pandemics are too big to be solved in isolation, and the United Arab Emirates is committed to making meaningful contribution to confronting each of them. To explore how this is possible, it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Edward Jung. He is one of the world's most productive and successful innovators, with more than 1,200 worldwide patents in fields such as biomedicine, computing, networking, energy, and material sciences. He is the founder of Intellectual Ventures and innovation advisor to organizations such as Harvard Medical School, the National Academy of Sciences, the China Academy of Sciences, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the potential of these technologies is truly game-changing. And to explore that theme in more details, please join me in welcoming today's keynote speaker, Edward Jung.
Thank you very much. Again, Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be able to speak with you today about a topic of great passion for me, which is solving problems. And hopefully I'll be able to tell you something surprising to you, which is that it is actually possible for the UAE to lead the next wave of innovation, not just follow the previous ones. So let me talk about that a little bit. I'm going to say a few things here and then elaborate on them. Firstly, that innovation is the most important economic activity we can do, that contrary to popular belief, the system of innovation has changed many times in human history and even recent history. And the last three of these changes dramatically favor the United States. But innovation is being disrupted yet again, and this next wave actually could be a great opportunity for the UAE and other countries. So let me talk first about a little bit of history. Many analyses have shown that innovation is the primary driver of growth. As much as 80 to 85% of growth comes from innovation. This is a change because it was not true over 100 years ago. This effect has led to a massive golden age of invention starting about 100 to 120 years ago. Almost every modern convenience and aspect of life today, and almost every modern industry was generated out of that wave of invention. Whether it's electricity, polymers, vaccines, or computers, they were all developed in that area. And very surprisingly, all of them were either invented or co-invented by the United States. That dominance is very unusual, but it led to a great wave of productivity and an economic golden age. The kind of returns that were generated by these inventions number in the dozens of trillions of dollars, and maybe even more importantly, the healthcare benefit of that added 4 billion years of life to the world, which has been estimated to be worth $500 trillion of economic value. The impact of these innovations cannot be understated, but the impact was not evenly shared among nations. Modern innovation favored some regions over others. Looking at this chart, this is 200 years of the relative share of the global GDP. And you can see in 1800, China and India together represented half the global GDP, which was mostly indexed on labor and agriculture. Throughout the next 60 to 80 years, it dramatically changed, and the US went from less than 2% share of the GDP to almost 30%. During this time, there are at least 4 different waves where innovation fundamentally changed. During the time where the world was interested in industrialization, essentially improving the productivity of a nation, most of the innovations were done by individual inventors in a lab. You can think of a Nikola Tesla, you can think of a Henry Ford, you can think of a Wilbur and Orville Wright. All of these examples were small numbers of people, individuals essentially, in private laboratories. Once the productivity from that was realized, nations needed to actually step up to manufacturing, which required them to invest in infrastructure, roads, trains, ships, and so on, electrical grids. The innovation required there was too much for individual inventors, and so the innovation shifted to manufacturers' R&D and supply chain R&D. That lasted for several decades until after World War II, the rise of a very large consumer class meant suddenly you have to manufacture things in the quantity of millions to hundreds of millions. And to produce something like 10 million televisions or 20 million cameras or 30 million automobiles required yet another step up in the way innovation was done, and most of the innovation moved to multinationals, and the R&D was done there. In fact, after World War II in the United States, inventors stopped being a job category. It was just removed from the census. Then in the mid-70s, the pace of innovation illustrated that multinationals were too slow, and it led rise to a new kind of organization called a startup, which was more relentlessly focused on producing innovation, and that was the 4th wave. Now, interestingly, you can see that the last 3 waves here were a big part of American success. Startups were this latest disruption, and as we all know, they have actually changed the nature of economics, especially organizational economics. This is the top 5 ranked market cap companies in the United States, and you can see from the every 15-year period from 1965, they're pretty much the same kinds of companies. And as of last week, and a few years ago, there are companies that actually didn't even exist at the beginning of this chart. Now, why? How did this happen? These last three waves were predominantly about exceptional individualism. It was about certain people who led organizations or laboratories or science with a certain kind of genius that allowed them to be super successful and drive this kind of competitive environment where they were trying to be the one winner for some problem to completion. And this is actually why the United States got most of the lion's share of the benefit, because the United States is the country where exceptional individualism is strongly encouraged. I call this phase of 200 years of innovation basically the power of one. It was about making one inventor, one lab, one product, one country, one leader successful. And that's why the US dominated it, because the US is good at that. This is a graph showing the GDP share per capita. As you all know, China is rapidly approaching the GDP of the United States, but has 5 times the population. So on a per capita basis, it's still not the same kind of prosperity that the US enjoyed. Now let's talk about the future. That was the last 3 waves. Everybody's trying to follow that model today. But I'm going to say something a bit maybe controversial, and that is this power of one, this system that has been so successful, is done. We have become so good at basically this power of one system that every single problem that can be solved by one organization will get solved somewhere in the world, and in fact, multiple times. So, it kind of makes it less important. It also makes it super competitive. Every country now knows how to do startups and mass up manufacturing and so on. So it's super efficient. And when you go into that, you're going to a very hyper-competitive world where usually it's winner take most. So there's not so many winners. What's left if all these problems that can be solved by one company are solved are big problems that are too big for one company to solve. And I will point out, because of this, I believe one country will never dominate again. So that US exceptionalism is over. The power of one will be disrupted. The most important problems we face today, like climate management, feeding the earth, waste management, how to urbanize, how to grow old gracefully, these are too big for a single company. No one believes a single company will solve them. I'm going to go through the rest of these examples. These are trends in the world that basically show that the power of one is going to come to an end in terms of importance, and a new system will take its place. We all know these problems, and actually, this slide, for me, is 20 years old. There are problems that existed for a long time. We know we have healthcare problems. We know we have aging problems. We know we have agriculture, education, climate management. Nobody believes one company is going to solve any of these problems. It's just inconceivable. They will require partnerships and cooperation of thousands, if not 10,000s of companies. And yet the system we have built for this last 200 years does not promote that kind of collaboration. It promotes competition. It promotes ownership over sharing. And this, I think, is a problem. I believe the innovation of the future is a new way, the power of many instead of the power of one. That we must come up with systems where many inventors, many labs, many manufacturers, many leaders can come together in a global innovation ecosystem in order to solve problems together. At some level, it's already happening. Whether it's the internet, which was owned by no company, Linux, which was contributed to by 10,000 programmers, Wikipedia, millions of people contributing to this big piece of content. These led to entirely new systems of development and innovation. The most recent example of this, of course, was the COVID-19 R&D. This is not about looking at the charts. But the data analysis of COVID-19 R&D really shows that it was an example moving from power of one to power of many. Compared to the next most popular or most recent vaccine challenge, we were 20 times faster to first approval, 5 times more global R&D effort, much more cooperation, in fact, 10 times more trials than seemed economically feasible, showing that there are new kinds of incentive mechanisms that are in operation other than just making money. And almost every major country was a participant of this R&D. It was a new system and a new example that when the world was challenged, a new incentive mechanism emerged that allowed unprecedented sharing. Another trend we see today is the need competitively for speed and innovation. This is just a sample across 60 years of how different the world is from when the power of one was most powerful. The tenure of a company has gone from 61 years to 18 years in the S&P. The expected success rate, the average success rate of R&D investments went down from 81% to under 33%. A successful product in retail went from a 12-year lifetime to a 4-year lifetime, and maybe most importantly, a graduating student's expectation of how long their first job would last went from 31 years to 4 years. These are big changes that challenge the ability for the power of one to build hierarchical organizations of long duration to solve problems. Another trend, innovation is too distributed for the power of one. The United States used to be number 1 in innovation indexes all over the world. The Bloomberg index of last year put the United States at number 11. Interestingly, if you look at many of the countries that are in the top 10, like Finland, Denmark, Netherlands, Israel, Singapore, they're small countries. And I'll examine that a little more in detail later. But small countries actually are super competitive now in terms of innovation. We are now entering a new age of innovation, possibly just as important as the previous golden age I talked about. Examples that were in the video, including things like gene editing, user-generated content, AI, new foods, cryptocurrency. This is going to be huge growth for the future. But it's important to recognize that these inventions are actually different than the previous ones in that they are actually quite dangerous. Cryptocurrency or gene editing or things like DAOs have the potential of creating much more social disruption than plastic, semiconductors, or cameras. It's actually fundamentally different in that way, that we are now working on technologies and inventions that as much value as they can produce, they can also create tremendous amounts of harm. We know that the power of one, a relentless form of capitalism, tends to promote profit from bad behaviors. This is an example of the largest CPG companies by revenue. You will see that they're all about sugar, salt, fat, nicotine, vanity, and alcohol. Why? Because our genetics, the way we are built, causes us to like those things. It is society and religions and organizations like that that allow us to step away from that. But capitalism will always want to make a business out of something you're addicted to or you can't help like. That's just good business. When you look at these technologies, they have a similar issue, that its impact could be very negative. What does that tell you? The power of one actually separated policy and regulation from innovation. But in the future, we must actually embrace evolution with society, policy, and regulation. All these new technologies will have tremendous social implications. Lots of downside as well as upside. And the traditional groups like the United States that used to be responsible for coming up with those policies are no longer trusted and have actually done a very bad job in the recent years. And I don't think most countries will trust China to come up with those policies either. So what does that mean? The world now actually needs innovation in policy and regulation just as much as in technology. So it needs agility and experimentation in policy. I'll come back to that in a moment. Another trend, of course, is talent is mobile. The US, one of the main reasons it was such an invention center, so dominant in that for 150 years, is it had lots of immigration and picked some of the best minds around the world. As you can see here, that seems to be changing. Not only can people stay where they are and contribute productively, but actually all those places they stay are much better than they were 50 or 100 years ago. This is an opportunity as well. So I'm going to bring this all together in something I call the power of small. And this is a thing that sometimes surprises people, but it's something I tremendously believe in. One, this transition from power of one to power of many allows all countries to participate. That's pretty new. It used to be you had to be a big country to participate. You had to have a lot of resources to participate. Now, in many things, small countries can participate. Anyone can. But more importantly, it gives small countries certain superpowers that actually give them advantages over big countries. So this is a lot to read, but I'm going to go through these because I think they're important for UAE. One, high per capita GDP. What does that mean? When you have a high per capita GDP, you can educate and re-educate your workforce, and your consumers can adopt new technologies because they have the spending money. The demand can be there. If you look at the top 10 high per capita GDP countries, the United States is the only one with a population over 12 million. And you can take that all the way to the top 30, where it becomes the only one with a population over 100 million. But it's very unique in that factor, and the rising tide is really small countries. Secondly, to the point I made earlier, small countries can be agile with policy changes. They can experiment with policy changes, which allows them to adapt to new technologies in a way large countries cannot. I've worked with policy in the United States and in China. It's very hard and very slow to get anything passed because it's a big, diverse country. Small countries like Finland or Israel that I've worked with can move very quickly. They can make these kind of experiments, and that will lead the next generation of technologies to understand how to be used in a socially responsible way. Small countries can update their infrastructure faster. They can actually deploy it faster. It's much, much easier to deploy 5G in a small country than a big country. But even if you decided to get into something like tissue engineering, it's much easier to deploy that in a small country than a big country. Stronger social coordination creates more responsible behaviors. I mean, certainly that's evident here. The example of the UAE's performance during the COVID pandemic is a clear example of this. I advised many countries during the COVID pandemic. It wasn't a matter of science that was the problem. It was a matter of responsible social coordination. It really illustrated an issue that became front and center about some of the difficulties in having a Western type of social economy where responsible behaviors were very hard to generate. And finally, given that large pool of elite workers that are now all over the world and maybe not coming to the United States, it's possible for small countries to make interesting incentives for those people to show up. These are examples of why, well, I'm here, but also why I want to talk to small countries, because I believe they will lead the next generation. When I was at Microsoft and we were looking at telecom policy as an example, the United States completely froze on the ability to deploy digital and cellular. Who was the first movers? New Zealand, South Korea, Finland. And at least in the case of South Korea and Finland, they still are dominant forces in that sector. It's only after they figured out how to do it that the United States followed, both in terms of policy and in economics. So this, I think, is a future, the power of small. So I'm here to really see if UAE will ignite 1 million minds and then lead this next revolution in innovation. Because I feel it is what we absolutely require to solve those large problems that we listed earlier. They are not going to be solved by the old system. They're going to be inefficiently done. It's a coordinated effort like this that is going to be required. So, just to summarize what I've talked about. 1, controversially, I think this system that's worked for 200 years is coming to an end. That's pretty controversial to say. I think it's because all the problems that will be solved by that system will be solved by many people. So it's important to know how to do it. So I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but it's not the most important thing. Almost every problem like that will just get solved on its own. That leaves the big global problems, and that needs a new system. And that new system is very hard for large countries to do. In fact, that new system really plays the strengths of small countries that are agile in policy and responsible in society. And the UAE could be an exceptional leader in doing that. So let's go solve those problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edward, for this fascinating lecture. And now we'll start with our Q&A session. So you spoke about the new innovation system. And so tell us, what do you suggest that you should do to lead in that new innovation system? And what are the first steps?
Well, the first steps are actually a lot like this forum. It starts with a conversation. And there's a lot of technologies that can be brought to bear to bring new incentive systems together that are not just based on capitalism, just based on making money. That's been shown in many experiments by the Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom, but also experiments that have been done on blockchain with certain tokens. Not cryptocurrency again, but it's about making kind of value out of production. And I think much like has been done in setting up a financial exchange here, there's actually a lot of value in building a kind of exchange for that value. The value of actually progress against problems like that. And I have a lot of ideas and prototypes and pilots we have run, over 900 projects in systems like this. And I believe if UAE adopted something like that, it could at least experiment to see if this is something that works for the larger world and bigger problems. So I think the first step is having a conversation about it, being open-minded about it, and then deciding, is there a project or a pilot to try?
Thank you. Innovation is deeply connected to how we educate. You have explained what governments can do to accelerate education, but I wanted to ask you about schools and the first stages of the conveyor belt of talent. What is the next big idea that you get excited about in the area of edutech, and what innovations are transforming the future of education?
Well, you may not like the answer I'm going to give, but it's, I think edtech is very important, and obviously education is very important. But you can ask the question of, what problem are you trying to solve with education? Are you trying to create, you're trying to take a person and make them productive in society? Or are you trying to take a person and maximize their individual potential? And those are two different things. And you'd like them to overlap, but it's not clear that edtech, which is kind of software that needs a program, is maybe the best way to figure that out. First, just figure it out, and then you can build a program for it. Now, if it's about learning a specific well-known skill, like in engineering or medicine, or it's about, passing a test, edtech is extremely valuable. I spent some time with one of the founders of Infosys, who, despite being one of the founders, spent all of his time dedicated toward the Infosys internal education system. They bring in tremendous numbers of talented Indian engineers from the best universities there and essentially have to retrain them. And so they spent a lot of effort on that retraining. And unlike a typical university, they could try lots of different things because they are themselves a tech company. So I found a lot of what they learned from that very interesting. And the first things that they kind of learned from it is, one, social networks and mentoring networks are super important. That's not what EdTech is. EdTech can help that, but firstly, you have to have these people connections. Secondly, it's experience. So when you're in school, you may not get very much experience with real-world problems. But I have a customer that uses this kind of system we talked about, and he has a kid in graduate school, and he was saying he's president of a large manufacturing company, and he said, I tell my kid, don't come work at my company. Go in a system like that and see what the real problems are in the world, and see how you can apply what you learned to all those different problems. That's much more valuable to you in a world where your expectation is 4 years of employment instead of 31. That's much more valuable for you to understand with your education. Now, EdTech can help that, but first we have to decide that's the goal of it, right? And so first thing is, what are the goals? I think may not be the answer you're looking for, but it's the one I have.
Speaking about climate change, it's obvious no one nation can solve or escape from it. So how do you resolve the current state of individual nations or institutions addressing a global issue?
Well, I think, it's very natural when you're trying to coordinate groups, to coordinate them around some topics. But one of the problems with topics is that they're so well understood that, let's say it's nations or companies, they'll all bring their experts in that thing, and all they'll do is argue because they're experts at that topic. In order to actually make progress, you actually have to get them to understand that there's a lot more they don't know than they know. And that starts an interesting conversation. So for some of the people I've been working with in these climate projects, I introduced them to this group I've known for 10 years, and they're accountants. And what they figured out is that if you could change a couple of accounting rules, you could make it much more interesting to the CFO of companies to invest a lot of money in climate change, whereas right now it's treated as an expense and it hits the bottom line. That's a weird example, but it's an example of why you need all these different disciplines working together, because then it surprises them that you can take the conversation to the CFO, not just the R&D guy. The R&D guy wants to show he's smarter than everyone else. CFO just wants to actually make a better profit. So I think there are many ways like that suggest themselves once you start expanding what you're looking at. I also think that when you are inclusive, you get a lot more people excited about contributing. We worked on a project to make more efficient natural gas extraction. And we ended up involving like acoustic engineers, and they never thought they were relevant to it, people in imaging. And that got them actually quite excited. And we could get incredibly powerful people in that topic who aren't going to argue. They can't have an argument with a petroleum engineer. It's just they're talking two different things. But when they show that they can have value to it, you kind of change the conversation. It's almost a social engineering thing. But I think a lot of that has to happen to break through these barriers that are in climate management, a lot of stovepipes.
True. Thank you. This leads us to our last question. Your background is in biomedical research, including protein structure. How did you receive the news of the AI breakthrough in protein folding? And can you explain to us why this is seen as such an incredible jump in the field of biology and medicine?
Yes, actually, my research work was, in fact, in figuring out the structure of proteins and how they interact. And so proteins are a big component of how your biology works. It both communicates and operates in proteins. And in order to affect it, you basically need to connect to the protein, which is to bind to it. To do that, you need to know the structure. Now, for all of human history that we've been making medicines or using natural roots or whatever, what we do is we randomly try things until we get the result we want. And there's been a long time people have been trying to figure out, can you use a computer to now figure out how to engineer something that does the right thing? So this protein folding thing, the AlphaFold and so on, has been great progress. However, much like what happened in 2000 or so with sequencing the genome, it's just the very beginning. So people will get quite excited, but it really is just the tip of a tremendous amount of work. Now then figure out what proteins do what are the network and signaling and so on and so forth, so-called systems biology. So there'll be a lot of steps, but it's a very important component to that step. So I'm excited about it, but I caution people not to think that immediately it's going to cure cancer because the body is really complicated. And if you disturb one thing, you often disturb many things. And understanding those networks, we're still early.
Thank you so much, Edward, for your invaluable insights today. في الختام، تناولت محاضرة اليوم أن القفزات الكبيرة التي شهدناها في مسيرة التكنولوجيا مؤخراً تتيح لنا العديد من الفرص التي يمكن الاستفادة منها، وكذلك تسبب بعض التحديات التي يجب على الجميع مواجهتها أو إيجاد حلول لها. أهمية تعاون المؤسسات مع بعضها البعض لحل أكبر التحديات العالمية والابتعاد عن الفكر الفردي في حلها. هناك فرصة كبيرة للمجتمعات والدول الصغيرة في خلق بيئة جاذبة ومحفزة للابتكار تدعمها التشريعات المرنة والروابط الاجتماعية القوية. وأخيراً أتقدم بالشكر إلى صاحب السمو الشيخ محمد بن زايد آل نهيان ولي عهد أبو ظبي نائب القائد الأعلى للقوات المسلحة لتكرمه باستضافة هذا المجلس الموقر، وإلى السيد إدوارد جونغ لتزويدنا بالمعلومات القيمة، وكذلك المتحدثين والحضور الكريم. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.